"Joseph, my son," she said, her voice soft, almost fragile. His heart stopped. The word "son" echoed in his mind, a punch to the gut that left him breathless. This woman, his mother. After all these years. He took a step back, shock and disbelief swelling in his chest. Could this really be her? The woman who had left him as a child, who had disappeared from his life without a trace. "What do you want?" Joseph asked, his voice cold, distant, and hard, the words cutting through the air like shards of ice. Just as Joseph was about to send Mama Divine away, Glory entered the room. She looked at the woman kneeling at the door and then at Joseph, her face filled with confusion. The sight of Mama Divine, tired, fragile, and almost broken, struck her, and she immediately knew something was wrong. "Who is this?" Glory asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of concern. Joseph's heart skipped a beat. Panic rose within him. He didn't want Glory to see this part of his life, this painful and messy history he had been trying to bury for so long. Without thinking, without fully grasping the consequences, he quickly said, She's my maid." In the bustling city of Abuja, there was a small boy named Joseph. Joseph was only 10 years old, but he already knew a lot about survival. Life hadn't been kind to him, and he had no family to lean on. No father to guide him, no mother to comfort him, and no siblings to share his pain or joy. He was utterly alone, yet every day, he faced life with remarkable courage and determination. Joseph's world was a rough corner of the city, where the hustle and bustle never seemed to end. His home was nothing more than a tiny corner in a rundown alley, tucked away from the crowded streets. This makeshift shelter was all he had. A flattened cardboard box served as his bed, and a tattered cloth he found on a rainy night was his blanket. In one corner, he kept a small plastic bag containing his few precious belongings, an old photograph of his parents, a notebook with blank pages, and a pencil stub that he treasured as though it were made of gold. Despite his challenging circumstances, Joseph had an unshakable spirit. Every morning, as the sun rose over the tall buildings and cast its golden light on the city, Joseph would wake up with a sense of purpose. Life was tough, but he believed in a better tomorrow. Joseph's main source of income was selling meat pies and fish rolls. Balancing a tray on his head, he would walk through the busy streets, weaving between cars and pedestrians, calling out in his clear, energetic voice, "Hot meat pies. Fresh fish rolls. Come and buy." His voice carried over the noise of the city, and his genuine smile often drew people in. Even though he worked hard, Joseph's earnings were meager. After paying the woman, who allowed him to take the meat pies and fish rolls on credit, he was left with just enough to buy himself a simple meal of bread and water. Sometimes, on better days, he saved a little money, holding on to the dream that kept him going, the dream of going to school. Joseph was fascinated by schools. Whenever he passed by one, he would stop and watch the children in their neatly pressed uniforms, carrying colorful backpacks filled with books. They laughed and chatted as they entered the school gates, and their joy was like a spark of hope in Joseph's heart. He dreamed of wearing a uniform, sitting in a classroom, and raising his hand to answer a question. But for now, school was a far-off dream, one he couldn't afford yet. When Joseph wasn't selling meat pies and fish rolls, he had another way of earning money, picking up plastic bottles. The streets of Abuja were filled with discarded bottles, especially around markets and bus stops. To most people, they were just trash, but to Joseph, they were opportunities. Armed with a small sack, he would walk through alleys and crowded areas, scanning every corner for bottles. When he found one, he'd carefully pick it up, adding it to his collection. At the end of the day, he'd sell them to recyclers for a small amount. Every coin he earned brought him a tiny step closer to fulfilling his dream. Joseph's days were exhausting, but he found joy in the little things, kind smiles from strangers, a friendly word from a customer, or a cool breeze after a hot afternoon. Sometimes, he even imagined what it would be like to have a family again, to sit around a table and share a meal with people who loved him. But until that day came, Joseph relied on his resilience and his unwavering belief that life could get better. As he walked through the streets, balancing his tray and calling out to customers. Joseph wasn't just a boy selling snacks. He was a dreamer, a fighter, and a reminder that even in the hardest circumstances, hope could shine brighter than the sun over Abuja's crowded streets. Every morning was a new beginning, and every step he took brought him closer to his dream. He didn't know how or when his life would change, but deep in his heart, he believed that someday, it would. One sunny afternoon in the lively streets of Abuja, Joseph was busy picking bottles near a bustling market. The clatter of vendors, the honking of cars, and the chatter of passers-by filled the air, but Joseph was focused. His eyes darted from corner to corner, searching for discarded plastic bottles. As he bent down to pick one near the edge of a building, a faint voice caught his attention. Curious, he followed the sound until he found himself outside a small classroom with an open window. The voice was clear now, it was a teacher speaking. Joseph froze, mesmerized by the unfamiliar words flowing from the teacher's lips. The man inside was explaining something about numbers and science, using a chalkboard filled with equations and diagrams. Joseph didn't understand most of it, but he was captivated. He pressed closer, standing on his toes to get a better view through the window. Inside, children sat at desks, their heads bent over notebooks, their hands raised eagerly to answer questions. Joseph's heart swelled with a longing so strong it made his chest ache. That night, as Joseph lay on his cardboard bed in his alleyway corner, the image of the classroom played over and over in his mind. He closed his eyes and imagined himself wearing a school uniform, sitting at a desk with a pencil in hand, solving problems on a chalkboard. He could almost hear the teacher calling his name to answer a question. The thought filled him with a determination he had never felt before. Clutching his old cloth blanket tighter, Joseph made a silent promise to himself. One day, no matter how hard it was, he would go to school. He would sit in a classroom, learn math and science, and maybe even make friends. The next morning, Joseph woke up with a new sense of purpose. He worked harder than ever, balancing his tray of meat pies and fish rolls on his head as he navigated the crowded streets. His voice rang out louder, his steps were quicker, and his smile was brighter as he sold to customers. When the day's work was done, he picked bottles late into the evening, searching every corner he could find. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Joseph saved every naira he could. Sometimes, he skipped meals, drinking water instead of eating, just to add a few more coins to his stash. He kept his money in a small tin can he hid carefully in his shelter. Each time he added to it, his dream felt a little closer. Finally, one morning, Joseph counted his savings and realized he had enough to buy a second-hand school uniform and a few books. His hands trembled with excitement as he held the money, imagining himself finally stepping into a classroom. That afternoon, Joseph walked to a nearby school he had often passed while selling snacks. It was a small, modest building, but to Joseph, it was a place of endless possibilities. Clutching his tin can of savings, he walked through the school gates, his heart pounding. Inside, Joseph approached a group of teachers standing near the entrance. They turned to him, surprised by the sight of the small boy with torn clothes, dusty feet, and rough hands. But Joseph's eyes shone with determination as he explained why he was there. He showed them his savings, carefully pouring out the coins he had worked so hard to earn. The teachers exchanged glances, their expressions softening as they listened to Joseph's story. They saw the hope in his eyes and the sincerity in his voice. One teacher knelt down to his level and asked, "Are you sure you want this? School can be tough, and it's not just about money. It's about hard work, discipline, and commitment." Joseph nodded firmly. "I'll do anything," he said. "I just want to learn." The teachers were moved by his determination. After a brief discussion, they agreed to enroll him. They took his savings and helped him buy a uniform and a few basic supplies. Joseph could hardly believe it as they handed him the neatly folded uniform. That night, as he lay in his makeshift shelter, Joseph held the uniform close to his chest, a smile spreading across his face. For the first time in a long while, he felt like his dream was no longer just a dream, it was becoming a reality. The teachers at the school couldn't help but be moved by Joseph's story. Despite not having a guardian or anyone to officially sign him up, they decided to make an exception. They arranged for him to attend classes, knowing how much it meant to him. Joseph could hardly believe it when they handed him his schedule and welcomed him to the school. On his first day, Joseph stepped into the classroom, his second-hand uniform neatly ironed. His heart raced as he took a seat at the back of the class. Around him, children whispered and giggled, some casting curious glances at the new boy. But Joseph wasn't bothered. He was finally in a classroom, and that was all that mattered. As the teacher began the lesson, Joseph leaned forward, hanging on to every word. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he scribbled notes into his notebook. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged somewhere. Over the weeks that followed, Joseph's passion for learning became evident to everyone. He was always the first to raise his hand when the teacher asked a question, and he soaked up every lesson like a sponge. Subjects like mathematics and science fascinated him, and he spent hours after school trying to solve problems and understand new concepts. Despite his challenges, Joseph quickly became one of the brightest students in the school. The teachers were amazed by his curiosity and determination. They often found him staying back after class to ask questions or borrow books from the small school library. He had no one to help him with homework or buy him new clothes, but he didn't let that stop him. Every morning, he arrived at school with a smile, eager to learn. But while school brought Joseph joy, his struggles outside the classroom didn't disappear. After classes, he returned to the streets, balancing his tray of meat pies and fish rolls as he called out to customers. In the evenings, he scavenged for bottles, carefully adding every coin he earned to his savings tin. His life was a constant balance of school and work, with little time for play. Yet, Joseph didn't complain. He knew he was working towards something greater. Each day, he reminded himself that every step he took brought him closer to the future he dreamed of. One day, as Joseph walked home from school, carrying his one notebook under his arm, he noticed other children walking with their parents. They laughed and talked, their parents carrying their bags and asking about their day. Joseph slowed his steps, watching the joyful scenes unfold around him. A little boy ran to his mother, who scooped him up in a warm hug. Another child tugged at his father's hand, chattering excitedly about a game they had played in school. A sharp pang of loneliness gripped Joseph's chest. He stopped for a moment, clutching his notebook tightly as he tried to push the feeling away. But no matter how hard he tried, the ache lingered. He imagined what it would be like to have someone waiting for him at the end of the day, asking about his lessons, praising his efforts, or simply holding his hand as they walked home together. Joseph swallowed hard and forced himself to keep walking. His steps were slower now, his mind filled with thoughts of the family he had never known. As he approached his alleyway corner, the familiar sight of his makeshift shelter reminded him of how far he had come and how far he still had to go. That evening, as Joseph lay on his cardboard bed, he stared up at the stars visible through the gaps in the buildings. The loneliness was still there, but so was his determination. He reminded himself of the promise he had made, to build a better future for himself, no matter how hard it got. Maybe one day, he whispered to the night sky, I have someone who cares about me. But until then, I keep going. With that thought, he closed his eyes, ready to face whatever challenges the next day would bring. Years later, he entered into university. Joseph's life was nothing like it used to be. His recycling business, which had started with him picking bottles off the streets, had grown far beyond what he ever imagined. Now, he had a team of boys from the same streets he once roamed. They worked with him, collecting and sorting bottles, earning honest pay that helped them avoid the hardships and dangers Joseph had faced as a child. Each of the boys admired Joseph deeply. To them, he was more than just a boss, he was proof that it was possible to rise above the streets and create a better life. Joseph never forgot where he came from, and he treated his workers with kindness and respect. He mentored them, encouraging them to think about their futures and set goals, just as he had done. One sunny afternoon, as Joseph stood at his recycling center, overseeing the sorting of materials, a man in a crisp suit walked in. His presence immediately drew attention, and Joseph stepped forward to greet him. The man smiled warmly and extended his hand. Good afternoon. My name is Mr. Felix, and I'm a representative from the Abuja state government, the man said, his voice steady and professional. Joseph shook his hand, curious but slightly nervous. Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you? Mr. Felix's smile widened. Actually, it's the government that wants to help you. We've been monitoring your efforts to clean up the city and reduce waste. Your work has not only made a positive environmental impact but has also provided opportunities for many young people. It's inspiring, Joseph. Joseph's heart raced as he listened. The man's words felt surreal, like something out of a dream. We believe you have the potential to make an even greater difference, Mr. Felix continued. The government wants to support you in expanding your operations further. With additional resources and funding, you could scale your business to reach more areas and create even more impact. For a moment, Joseph was speechless. Just a few years ago, he had been a boy scavenging for bottles to survive, and now, the government wanted to partner with him. He felt a wave of pride and gratitude, not only for the opportunity but for the journey that had brought him here. I don't know what to say, Joseph finally managed, his voice filled with emotion. Thank you, sir. I'm truly honored. Mr. Felix nodded. You've earned it, Joseph. Keep up the good work. With the government's support, Joseph's recycling business grew beyond anything he could have dreamed. He expanded his operations to multiple locations across Abuja, employing more people and collaborating with local companies to recycle on a larger scale. His name became known not just in his community but across the city as a young entrepreneur with a vision and a heart for change. As his recycling empire blossomed, Joseph found himself earning more money than he had ever imagined. He thought back to the days when he had barely enough to buy food, when every coin was precious, and every meal was a blessing. Now, he had enough to afford a comfortable life. With his first big earnings, Joseph rented a modest but cozy apartment. It was a far cry from the cardboard bed he once slept on in the alley. The apartment had clean walls, a soft bed, and even a small table where he could study. For the first time, Joseph felt a sense of true stability. He also bought himself some new clothes, carefully choosing items that were simple yet presentable. He wanted to look professional and confident without forgetting his humble beginnings. Despite his newfound wealth, Joseph remained grounded. He continued to live modestly, investing most of his earnings back into his business and the community. As he stood on the balcony of his apartment one evening, looking out at the bustling streets of Abuja, Joseph felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had come so far from the little boy who wandered the streets, selling meat pies and picking bottles. But even as he achieved success, Joseph knew his journey was far from over. There was still so much he wanted to do, not just for himself, but for others like him who were still struggling to find their way. This is only the beginning, Joseph said to himself, determination shining in his eyes. With a heart full of gratitude and a mindset on making an even greater impact, Joseph prepared for the next chapter of his incredible journey. Despite all his success, Joseph felt a void deep within him. The day of his university graduation arrived, and while his classmates were surrounded by family members cheering and celebrating, Joseph stood alone. The joy and pride of the occasion were overshadowed by an overwhelming sense of loneliness. He watched as his peers hugged their parents, posed for photos, and celebrated with loved ones. His heart ached with longing as he clutched his certificate, the weight of his solitary journey pressing on him. As the ceremony wound down and Joseph prepared to leave quietly, a voice broke through his thoughts. You don't have anyone here, do you? Joseph turned to see a young woman standing beside him. It was Glory, a classmate he had noticed in passing but never really spoken to. She was known for her kind nature and a warm, radiant smile that seemed to light up any room she entered. For a moment, Joseph couldn't find the words to respond. He simply nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. Glory's smile didn't falter. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and held it out. Here, she said with gentle enthusiasm. Let's take a picture together. We can celebrate together. Joseph blinked in surprise but managed a small smile as they posed for a few pictures. For the first time that day, he felt the weight of his loneliness lift, even if just a little. After the photos, they started talking. Glory asked about his life, his journey, and his plans for the future. At first, Joseph hesitated, unsure if he should share the details of his struggles and triumphs. But something about Glory's genuine interest and warm demeanor encouraged him to open up. He told her about his humble beginnings, his days of selling meat pies and fish rolls, and picking bottles to survive. He shared how he had grown his recycling business from the ground up and how it had become a beacon of hope for others like him. Glory listened intently, her admiration for him growing with every word. "You're incredible, Joseph," she said softly, her eyes shining with respect. "You've been through so much, yet you've accomplished so much more. You should be proud of yourself." Joseph felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in a long time. For the first time, someone saw him not just as a success story but as a person who had overcome incredible odds. Before they parted ways, they exchanged phone numbers and promised to stay in touch. Over the following months, Glory became a constant presence in Joseph's life. They spent time together, sharing meals, visiting parks, and discussing their dreams. Glory's kindness and intelligence left a lasting impression on Joseph, and he found himself looking forward to their conversations more than anything else. One evening, as they sat together discussing his business, Glory proposed a bold idea. "What if you partnered with local businesses?" she suggested. "You could create a system where they support your recycling efforts, and in return, they get recognized for being environmentally responsible. It's a win-win, and it would bring even more attention to your work." Joseph listened intently, impressed by her insight. "That's brilliant," he said after a moment of thought. "I've never considered that before, but it makes so much sense." Inspired by her suggestion, Joseph wasted no time putting the idea into action. He reached out to local businesses, pitching the idea of partnerships that promoted recycling while benefiting their brands. The response was overwhelmingly positive, and within months, his business expanded even further. The partnerships not only boosted his operations but also attracted media attention. Soon, news outlets across Abuja began featuring Joseph's story. Articles and television segments highlighted his journey from the streets to becoming an environmental entrepreneur, inspiring countless others. Businesses, schools, and even government agencies began reaching out to collaborate with him, and his impact on the community grew exponentially. Through it all, Glory remained by his side, celebrating his victories and encouraging him during challenges. Joseph often found himself marveling at how much his life had changed since the day they first met. Glory wasn't just a friend, she had become his confidant, his partner in ideas, and a source of unwavering support. And for the first time in a long while, Joseph didn't feel alone anymore. He had found not only success but also a connection that made his achievements all the more meaningful. Grateful and overwhelmed by her unwavering support, Joseph began to realize the depth of his feelings for Glory. She wasn't just a friend or a partner in ideas, she had become his source of strength, someone who made him feel whole in ways he'd never imagined. Her kindness, intelligence, and boundless compassion reflected everything he had ever dreamed of in a partner. Glory had given him something he had longed for all his life, a sense of belonging. As his love for her grew stronger, Joseph started envisioning a future with her. He thought about the life they could build together, a life filled with love, mutual respect, and shared dreams. The boy who once wandered the streets of Abuja, searching for scraps to survive, now dreamed of a life with someone who truly believed in him and cared for him. Glory had become the light in Joseph's life, a steady and comforting presence. With her, he felt safe to share his innermost fears and aspirations, things he had always kept buried deep inside. Their friendship grew deeper with each passing day, and soon, Joseph found himself longing to be more than just a friend to her. He wanted her to be his partner, his companion, his everything. One evening, after hosting a particularly successful event for his recycling program, Joseph invited Glory out to celebrate. They chose a quiet, cozy restaurant, where the atmosphere was filled with laughter and the scent of freshly prepared meals. Over plates of jollof rice and grilled fish, they talked about everything, his journey from the streets, her dreams of helping underserved communities, and their shared passion for making the world a better place. "You know," Joseph said, smiling at her, "meeting you feels like finding the missing piece of my life. I don't think I've ever said this, but I'm so grateful for you, Glory. Her cheeks flushed slightly, but she returned his smile. Joseph, you've been through so much and accomplished so much more. I'm just glad I get to be a part of your story. Her words stayed with him, filling his heart with warmth. Over the following weeks, Joseph and Glory spent even more time together. Whether they were brainstorming ideas for his business, volunteering at community events, or simply sharing a quiet moment, Joseph found himself more drawn to her with each passing day. One evening, as the sun began to set, Joseph invited Glory to take a walk along the banks of the serene Ocean River. The golden light danced on the water's surface, creating a breathtaking backdrop as they strolled side by side. Joseph's heart raced as he realized this was the perfect moment to share what he had been feeling for so long. He stopped walking and turned to face her. Glory, he began, his voice steadied despite the storm of emotions within him, I've been meaning to tell you something. She tilted her head slightly, her warm, curious gaze encouraging him to continue. You've been more than a friend to me, he said, his eyes locked on hers. You've brought light into my life, and for the first time, I feel like I have someone I can truly share everything with. Glory, he began, his voice soft, I don't know how to say this, but you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. I don't know where I'd be without you. You've been there for me, supported me, and believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. Glory listened quietly, her gaze never leaving his. She had a gentle smile on her face, and Joseph felt his heart race as he continued. I don't want to just be friends, Glory. I love you, and I want to be with you. For a moment, there was silence as she processed his words. Then, to his relief, Glory reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. I love you too, Joseph, she replied softly. I've been waiting for you to say that. Joseph's heart soared. He felt like all the loneliness he'd ever felt was finally fading, replaced by a warmth he hadn't known he needed. They walked together in silence, hand in hand, both feeling as if they had found exactly what they'd been searching for. Their relationship blossomed, and before long, they were making plans for a future together. Glory continued to help Joseph with his business, bringing fresh ideas and a new perspective that kept things exciting and innovative. With her by his side, Joseph felt invincible. The business grew even faster, catching the attention of more influential figures in Abuja and beyond. But life, as always, had its own plans. One afternoon, Joseph was at home in Abuja, going over some business documents. The quiet of the day was soothing, but as he walked, the doorbell rang, breaking his concentration. He wasn't expecting anyone, which made him curious. Who could it be? When he opened the door, he was met with an unexpected sight, an older woman, her face lined with deep wrinkles, her clothes worn and faded. She appeared fragile and tired, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a small bag to her chest. There was something unsettlingly familiar in her gaze, something that tugged at the corners of his memory, but it took a moment for it to register. Joseph didn't immediately recognize her, but the moment she spoke, everything clicked. Joseph, my son, she said, her voice soft, almost fragile. His heart stopped. The word son echoed in his mind, a punch to the gut that left him breathless. This woman, his mother. After all these years. He took a step back, shock and disbelief swelling in his chest. Could this really be her? The woman who had left him as a child, who had disappeared from his life without a trace. As memories from his childhood began to flood back, his time on the streets, the hunger, the cold nights, and the endless yearning for something to call his own, he felt a wave of anger rise in him. How could she show up now, after all the pain, all the years of struggle, all the hardships he had endured without her? He had worked so hard to build a life for himself, to escape the past, and now it felt like she was trying to tear it all apart. What do you want? Joseph asked, his voice cold, distant, and hard, the words cutting through the air like shards of ice. Mama Divine's face fell, and she lowered her gaze to the ground. Her shoulders slumped as if carrying the weight of all the years she had missed, the years she had lost with him. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Joseph. I was young, foolish, and I didn't know how to be a mother. I made mistakes. I left you because I thought you'd be better off. But I was wrong. I've regretted it every day since. Her words stirred something deep inside him, but his anger was stronger. How could he forgive her after everything she had put him through? How could she just show up like this, pretending everything could be made right? He wanted to slam the door, to never see her again, to keep the life he had worked so hard for without her presence haunting him. But the words stuck in his throat. Despite the pain and betrayal, a small part of him still longed for the connection he had been deprived of as a child, a connection that, in some twisted way, he had always hoped for. Just as Joseph was about to send Mama Divine away, Glory entered the room. She looked at the woman kneeling at the door and then at Joseph, her face filled with confusion. The sight of Mama Divine, tired, fragile, and almost broken, struck her, and she immediately knew something was wrong. "Who is this?" Glory asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of concern. Joseph's heart skipped a beat. Panic rose within him. He didn't want Glory to see this part of his life, this painful and messy history he had been trying to bury for so long. Without thinking, without fully grasping the consequences, he quickly said, She's my maid." Mama Divine's eyes widened in shock at his words, but she remained silent. Her trembling hands clutched the small bag in her lap as she lowered her head. She knew that Joseph was trying to shield Glory from the truth, trying to protect her from the shame that still haunted him. But in doing so, he was denying her, denying the bond they once had, the memories of a mother and child that had been lost. Glory was taken aback, but she didn't press the issue. She trusted Joseph. If he said the woman was just a maid, then it must be true. But the unease lingered in her. There was something about the situation that didn't sit right with her. The way Joseph's voice had trembled, the way his eyes avoided hers, it wasn't like him. She felt the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, and she could see the hardness in his expression. Joseph allowed Mama Divine to stay, but he did so with clear intentions. He wanted her to feel the sting of rejection, the pain he had carried for so long. He assigned her tasks around the house, cleaning, cooking, doing all the work that no one else wanted to do. Every morning, Mama Divine would wake up early, silently preparing breakfast, tidying the house, and performing the endless tasks Joseph assigned her. She never complained. She simply did as she was told, accepting her role with a quiet resignation. Her eyes, though, held a deep sadness, as if she believed this treatment was her due. She had abandoned her son all those years ago, and now she was being punished for it. Joseph's resentment grew with each passing day. Every time he saw Mama Divine, his anger simmered just beneath the surface. He couldn't shake the memories of his childhood, the nights spent alone on the cold streets, the hunger, the loneliness. He couldn't forget the feeling of abandonment, of being left behind by the woman who should have been there for him. And now, seeing her in his home, he wanted her to feel the emptiness he had lived with for so many years. He wanted her to understand the depth of his heart. But Glory was not blind to Joseph's behavior. She noticed how he treated Mama Divine. She could see the harshness in his words and actions, the way he gave Mama Divine the dirtiest jobs, the way he seemed to enjoy the power he held over her. It disturbed her. Joseph had always been kind to her, understanding and patient. But with Mama Divine, there was nothing but coldness. Glory knew that Joseph had been through a lot, but this wasn't the man she had fallen in love with. One day, Glory decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. She found Joseph in his office, sitting at his desk, deep in thought. He looked up when she entered, but there was something about him, something distant. It was like he wasn't really there, his mind somewhere else. "Joseph," Glory said softly, her voice full of concern as she stepped closer to him. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, hoping to calm the storm brewing within him. "We need to talk." Joseph turned to face her, his eyes hard and unreadable. He didn't say anything, but Glory could feel the tension in the air. "I don't understand why you're so harsh with her," Glory said quietly. "I know there's a lot of pain inside you, but she's an old woman now. Every time you shout at her or make her work beyond her strength, it feels wrong." Joseph's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he turned away from her, unable to look her in the eyes. He knew what she was saying was true, but the anger that had been festering inside him for so long was not so easily released. It had become a part of him, something he couldn't just cast aside. Letting go of his bitterness felt like letting go of a piece of himself. "She doesn't deserve my kindness, Glory," Joseph replied, his voice low and strained, thick with emotion. "She left me when I was just a child. I was alone all those years. She was supposed to be my mother, but she abandoned me. I had no one. And now she wants to show up like nothing happened." Glory nodded, her heart aching for him. She couldn't imagine the pain he had endured, the years of loneliness and loss. But she also saw the toll that this anger was taking on him. It was poisoning him, turning him into someone he wasn't, a man consumed by bitterness and resentment. "I understand that you're angry," Glory said gently, her voice filled with empathy. "But this isn't you. You've worked so hard to build a good life for yourself. You fought to find happiness, and now, you're letting this bitterness eat away at you. You don't have to forgive her all at once, Joseph. But maybe there's a middle ground. Maybe there's a way to heal." Joseph's expression softened, but the pain in his eyes remained. He didn't know how to let go of the hurt, how to forgive a woman who had abandoned him. It felt like betraying the little boy he had once been, the boy who had fought to survive without a mother. But at the same time, a part of him longed for peace. He wanted to let go of the anger. He just didn't know how. Glory sat beside him, her hand resting on his. She didn't say anything more, but her presence was enough. She knew it wouldn't be easy for Joseph, that healing wouldn't come overnight. But she was there for him, ready to support him as he took the first steps toward forgiveness, even if it took time. Joseph listened, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Part of him desperately wanted to let go of the anger that had consumed him for so long, but another part of him clung to it fiercely. The bitterness he had carried for so many years felt like an integral part of him, and the thought of forgiving Mama Divine felt like it might somehow erase all the pain he had endured throughout his life. The anger, he thought, was what had kept him alive through the darkest times. Letting it go would mean losing that last bit of strength. That evening, as Joseph sat in the living room, still wrestling with his feelings, something happened that forced him to confront his emotions head-on. He had been silent for hours, lost in his thoughts, when he heard raised voices coming from the kitchen. Curiosity piqued, Joseph stood up and walked toward the source of the noise, unsure of what he would find. As he approached, he heard Glory's voice, gentle but firm, as she spoke to Mama Divine. "Mama Divine," Glory's voice rang out, "I know things have been difficult, but you don't have to feel like you're just a maid here. You're family. You're part of this house." Joseph felt a sharp pang in his chest as he stood frozen in the doorway, listening. Glory's compassion was a stark contrast to the coldness that had taken root in his own heart. Mama Divine's voice quivered as she responded, and Joseph could hear the sorrow in her words. "No, my dear. I don't deserve to be treated as family. I left Joseph when he needed me the most. I failed him. I have no right to expect forgiveness. He has every right to hate me." Her words struck Joseph like a blow to the gut. For the first time, he saw the true depth of Mama Divine's regret, the weight of the guilt that she carried with her every day. She wasn't just an old woman trying to remain in his life out of a sense of obligation, she was a mother, deeply remorseful and desperate for a second chance. She had made a mistake, but in that moment, Joseph saw her pain, and it made his own heart seem so much more complicated. He didn't know what to think. His anger had always been a shield, protecting him from the emotional wounds he had suffered as a child, but now that shield was starting to feel heavy. Her words were forcing him to face a truth he had been avoiding for years. Mama Divine had never wanted to abandon him. She had made mistakes, just as he had. Could he forgive her? Could he let go of the resentment that had defined so much of his life? Glory, sensing the tension in the air, turned toward Joseph and locked eyes with him. Her gaze was soft, pleading, as she spoke the words that had been hanging in the air for so long. "Joseph, I think it's time you both talked about what happened. really talked. Joseph felt a surge of anger and pain rise within him, as though his emotions were trying to consume him. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to face the memories, the confusion, the hurt. But Glory was right. Avoiding the conversation wouldn't change anything. The years of silence, of bitterness, wouldn't suddenly fix the broken bond between him and Mama Divine. It was time to confront the past. With a reluctant nod, Joseph acknowledged Glory's words. He felt the weight of the moment, the pressure to do something he wasn't ready for. But he knew, deep down, that this conversation needed to happen. He had spent too long running from it. Glory, seeing the pain in his eyes, gently backed away. She left the kitchen, giving Joseph and Mama Divine the privacy they needed. The silence that followed was deafening, and Joseph could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Every part of him wanted to retreat, to push this moment away, but he couldn't. He turned to Mama Divine, who was still sitting at the small table in the kitchen, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes were downcast, her face etched with the sorrow that had become her constant companion. The years of regret and distance between them seemed insurmountable, but Joseph knew that if they were ever going to move forward, they had to face it together. "Sit down, Mama," Joseph said quietly, his voice breaking through the tension. He motioned to the chair across from her. Mama Divine slowly lifted her head, her eyes searching his face, as though she wasn't sure if she was allowed to take a seat. Joseph's heart ached as he saw the uncertainty in her expression. She was still so afraid, so unsure of her place in his life. But now, as they sat there in the quiet kitchen, the weight of the past hanging in the air, he knew it was time to face the truth. As she slowly sat down, Joseph took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He wasn't sure where to begin. The pain of those years, the abandonment, the feelings of being alone, it all came rushing back to him. But he couldn't avoid it anymore. The time had come for both of them to speak the truth, to truly talk about what had happened. Joseph sat across from Mama Divine at the small kitchen table. The air was thick with tension, and the silence was almost unbearable. His heart felt heavy, the pain of the past still fresh despite the years that had gone by. But he had promised Glory he would listen, so he waited for Mama Divine to speak. Mama Divine, her hands trembling, stared at the table as if gathering her thoughts. She took a deep breath, her voice breaking as she finally began. "Joseph," she said softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to understand why I did what I did. It wasn't because I didn't love you. I loved you more than anything in this world. But life was so hard, so unforgiving." She paused, clutching her hands tightly together, as if the memory of those days still had to recall. "I was just a young girl when I got pregnant with you," she continued, her voice shaking. "Your father, he left as soon as he found out. I thought my family would stand by me, but instead, they rejected me. They called me a disgrace, said I had shamed them. I had no job, no money, no friends to turn to. Everywhere I went, people looked at me with disgust. I felt so alone." Joseph's throat tightened as he listened. He had spent so many years hating her, imagining that she had abandoned him without a second thought. But now, hearing her story, he could feel the weight of her pain. "I suffered so much to carry you," Mama Divine went on, her voice breaking with emotion. "I didn't have enough to eat, didn't have a safe place to sleep. When it came time to give birth, I was all alone. I remember crying out in pain, praying for someone to help me. When you were born, you were so small, so fragile. I loved you with all my heart, Joseph, but I was terrified. I didn't know how I was going to take care of you." She wiped her tears with the edge of her wrapper, her body shaking as she sobbed. "I tried," she whispered. "I tried to keep you, to raise you. But I had nothing. No money, no home, no hope. I thought leaving you in that orphanage was the best thing I could do for you. I thought maybe you'd find a better life there, a life I couldn't give you. But it was the hardest thing I've ever done. I cried every day, Joseph. Every single day." She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with desperation. I didn't purposely abandon you. I didn't stop loving you. Please believe me. I've regretted it every moment of my life. I know it's hard for you to forgive me, but I'm begging you, Joseph. Please, find it in your heart to forgive me. Joseph sat silently, his emotions a whirlwind inside him. He had spent so many years building walls around his heart, protecting himself from the pain of her abandonment. But now, seeing her like this, broken and filled with regret, those walls began to crumble. Mama, he said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. I suffered. I passed through so much difficulty. There were nights I went to bed hungry, nights I cried myself to sleep. I felt so alone, so unloved. But today, I thank God. I thank Him for helping me survive, for giving me the strength to build a life for myself. He paused, looking into her tear-streaked face. Then, slowly, he reached out and wiped away her tears with his hand. Mama, he said softly, because of God, I forgive you. I forgive you for everything. Mama Divine let out a choked sob as Joseph stood and pulled her into his arms. She cried against his chest, her body trembling as years of guilt and regret poured out of her. Joseph held her tightly, his own tears falling freely. In that moment, the pain of the past began to fade, replaced by a sense of healing and hope. A few months later, Joseph and Glory stood hand in hand, smiling at each other as they exchanged their vows. Their wedding was a small, intimate affair, but it was filled with love and joy. Mama Divine sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son begin a new chapter of his life. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. After their wedding, Joseph and Glory began their life together, determined to build a future filled with happiness. Joseph worked hard to let go of the pain of the past, focusing instead on the blessings he had. One evening, Joseph, Glory, and Mama Divine sat together at the dining table. The aroma of Glory's delicious cooking filled the air as they shared a meal. Laughter echoed through the room as they told stories, their voices filled with warmth and joy. Joseph looked around the table, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had lost so much, but he had also gained so much more. He had a wife who loved him, a mother who was trying her best to make amends, and a future that was bright with promise. As they laughed and shared stories, Joseph realized that the pain of the past no longer held power over him. He had found forgiveness, love, and a sense of belonging. Dear viewers, if you were in Joseph's shoes, would you forgive the woman who left you? Do you believe in second chances and the power of forgiveness? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more inspiring stories.